Welcome back. A security guard patrolling a shopping center in Mexico captured footage of what appears to be a young child wandering around a play area long after the establishment had closed, and some suspect the youngster seen in the video could be a ghost. The eerie incident reportedly occurred late last month at the Plaza Santiago in the city of Cholula. While walking around the facility, the site's night watchman began filming a playground, and as he panned his cell phone over the barren equipment, suddenly caught sight of what appeared to be a child. Perturbed by what he had seen, the security guard turned the spooky footage over to the shopping center, which promptly posted it online. And the video went viral on social media and in Mexico, with some suggesting that the child in the video might possibly be a ghost, while others argued the footage was probably a marketing stunt by the plaza. You can check out the video for yourself and decide for yourself. That's in the carousel up at coasttocoastam.com. Back to more scary movies with Christopher Garetano when Coast to Coast returns right after these. We are back with Christopher Garetano, podcaster, filmmaker, author. The screenplay South Texas Blues is now available to book buyers, soon to be a motion picture. It tells the story of Toby Hooper and the making of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Exorcist, let's talk about that. That's a movie that I don't care if it's 50 years old. It's still, I don't even know if I would ever watch it again. I watched it once, and I have to admit, I was kind of traumatized by it. Hard to imagine that there were children actually in some theaters that were allowed to see that movie, and some of them I think were taken away in an ambulance, if I remember correctly. What are your thoughts? When did you first see The Exorcist?
I probably saw The Exorcist the first time, maybe I was 7 or 8 years old, believe it or not.
Wow, that's young.
6, yeah. So, because I grew up, my parents owned a video store when I was a kid, so I kind of got to see just about everything. I mean, I saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre around that same age. And just like you, the story you were telling in the beginning of the show, my folks would take me to the drive-in as well when, they couldn't find a sitter. Like I was reading in this ledger that my mother was writing about, me as a kid. And the first movie that I saw at the drive-in was Orca, the Killer Whale. So,
oh, yes, with Richard Harris. I remember that.
Yes. A Jaws ripoff, right? So, The Exorcist. Now, okay, it's so embedded in pop culture, and it has been satirized, and there are, once again, toys made of this thing. But when it came out, and I know you remember, it was a completely different story. And the movie to this day is so powerful. But I guess the only way to understand what it was like when it first came out for people that weren't there, you have to somehow remove all of the pop culture that followed. That's difficult. All of these sequels, even the one that just came out last week. It's like, how do you get that out of your head and go back to the purity of how this affected people? And this was made by another serious filmmaker, William Friedkin. And he wasn't the first choice for director. It wasn't until the producers, because the producers were arguing with William Peter Blatty, who wrote the novel, because that was his choice for director. And they said, no way. And they had several other people lined up. And when finally these people saw French Connection, they were like, okay, we agree. We want him more than you do. And William Peter Blatty knew William Friedkin for quite some time. In fact, there's a story that Friedkin wrote in his biography, his autobiography, when they first met. And Friedkin was making documentaries for television, and he was brutalized by some of these producers. So they knew each other for a long time, and Friedkin, William Peter Blatty believed in Friedkin. So he strongly wanted him as the director of this film, and it was the greatest choice. However, much like Hooper's set, which was very independent, Friedkin also put people through a living hell on that set to achieve what you saw on the screen.
Can you give me some examples of that?
Well, for instance, whereas today, when a room is supposed to be cold, the illusion of cold, okay, for one of these Insidious movies or whatever, like where it's supposed to be frigid in a room because there's a spirit there. In the case of The Exorcist, Friedkin actually refrigerated the room, and it was, it was freezing temperatures, and they were keeping people in there. And how, people understand how long it takes to even set up a scene, to get the lighting set up. So there was a very limited amount of time they could keep people in this room, and so people were freezing in that room. Now, as anyone recalls the film, there is a child in a scene who masturbates with a crucifix. This is gruesome stuff. I mean, the first time anyone's ever seen anything like that. And he actually had the child do that, and they were discussing how it was done. Another scene, he actually had a priest play Father Dyer. And at the end of the film, where Damien Karras sacrifices himself to get rid of this demon out of this child and tells the demon to come into himself, and then he jumps out a window and falls down that long flight of stairs. So there's a moment where Father Dyer is trying to give Damien Karras last rites, and Friedkin wanted this gentleman to cry, and he felt like he wasn't emoting enough, and he said to him, "Do you trust me?" And he said, "Yes," and he smashed him as hard as he could in his face, and then said, "Action, roll camera."
Wow.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to get away with that today, would you? I don't think.
I don't think so. To keep people on their toes, and several actors had a huge problem with this, including Max von Sydow, who played Father Merrin. Now, people thought von Sydow was, that people didn't know the actor, that this was an actual elderly man. It wasn't. He was 40 years old playing Father Merrin in this incredible Dick Smith makeup. But Friedkin was walking around the set to keep people on their toes. He was shooting a shotgun off. And a lot of people had problems with this. And so, I don't think he would be able to do the things that he was doing in the 70s between The French Connection and Sorcerer, that Friedkin wouldn't have gotten away with it today. But I think he was an innovative director until his passing, which was very recently. And I did not see the movie he left behind, but I want to, because he was one of the greats. And, an equally amazing movie was Sorcerer, that he made a few years after, quite a few years after The Exorcist came out, because he took a break. Oh, another powerful movie that he put people through a living hell to make. And that's a theme that runs consistently through a lot of these great movies, is that there was struggle, there was no comfort on these sets, and there was a brilliant visionary at the helm, somehow understanding that you can bring that, you can bring that to the table as an element somehow and shape that into the picture in the end and utilize it. It's dangerous, and you had asked earlier, was there something else that happened on the set of The Thing? I do recall I read that Kurt Russell was actually throwing a real piece of dynamite and nearly blew himself up.
Wow.
But I think Carpenter was a little more responsible at that time. And again, it killed his career. Yeah, he went right into making Christine after, but he said this many times in many interviews, that The Thing's reception, which was a masterpiece, almost killed his entire career, and he had to redeem himself with Universal, with Starman eventually. It's this is the struggle of the movie maker, even when you're making a masterpiece, it might not be received for many years later.
You mentioned Friedkin directing The Exorcist. I had read that you also mentioned Father Merrin, Max von Sydow. I hadn't realized he was that young when he was in the movie, 40 years old. But I was reading the original choice for Father Merrin was Marlon Brando, and Friedkin nixed that idea. But he didn't want this to be turned into a Marlon Brando picture.
No, and Friedkin was brutal on people, just like, and I had read his autobiography to learn this, that many people in the business were brutal to him, and I guess that reaction, he started treating people the same way, and it's not justified. I don't know, for various reasons, either to get a great performance or whatever, but even when Lalo Schifrin made the first score to The Exorcist. This is before they acquired Tubular Bells, which was already a creation by Goldfield. Schifrin had created this score, and he was very proud of it. And Friedkin literally took the reels out to the parking lot of the office building where they were meeting and lit it on fire in front of this guy's whole family and started screaming about it. Yeah, no, Friedkin was a madman at that time. You know, I mean, in comparison today, I don't think many people would get away with that. I don't think anybody would.
There's so much talk about the set of The Exorcist being cursed. And I had read where something like 9 people who were associated with the film passed away either during or shortly after. What do you make of that? And are there any sort of insights or stories you can tell about things that may have happened on the set?
Sure. I know there was one accident with a lighting technician that had died, and you know, some people associated. I know a driver was killed, and okay, I mean, I guess it depends on your superstition, what you believe, and I don't know. Do you believe that a film set can be cursed? I mean, the same was said about Poltergeist as well, and quite a few people died in different ways over the years, some tragically, far too young. So I don't know. It really depends on what you believe.
Yeah, I interviewed an exorcist once, and over the phone, I couldn't see him, and he went by the name Father X for the purpose of the interview, had to maintain his anonymity, and he was in New York, and I was alone in this big house when I interviewed him, and of course, it was a dark and stormy night, and so I asked him, I said, simply by talking about these things, do we... is there any jeopardy? You know, we might invite some demon or something, and he said yes. So he said that's it is a concern, and so he said a prayer over us before we started our conversation. And I often think about that. I have to be honest, Chris, I will not watch The Exorcist, and I don't think I'd ever bring it into the house. Well, you don't do that anymore. It's streaming and so forth, but I don't think I want my sons to watch it. Maybe when they're 30, they can. Maybe when I'm long gone, they can watch it. But it had that kind of a
powerful movie.
Oh.
You know, I can get myself in a headspace where I can remove all of that pop culture and really experience the film for what it is. And I had seen a movie maybe a little over a decade ago, I think it came out, by a French director named Pascal Laguerre called Martyrs. And when I watched that, I was like, must be not the American remake, the original. This must be the way people felt when they first saw The Exorcist, because it was a hardcore depiction of evil and the power of evil, and it was graphic and serious and dark. And I think, you know, because I've seen a lot of movies, and the only thing I think that could live up to that power and that dread was that movie that I saw. And there's an artistry to it too. You know, there's a true filmmaker behind it. And I after I saw Martyrs, I was you know, it was depressing. And I wonder, did you see The Exorcist in the theater when it came out?
No, I watched it, years later, probably 10 years after it came out, maybe on DV or VHS probably at that time.
And how did you feel when you first saw it?
Oh, I like I said, I was like 20 years old. I think I was traumatized by it.
Yeah, I did. You know, I saw it young too, because I had not seen part 2. You know, I only saw the original when I was a kid, and I think I first saw elements of it in a motion picture that came out, I think, in '83. It was a collection of horror films called Terror in the Aisles, and that's a great. If anybody wants to see all those classic scenes from those classic horror films, kind of narrated and guided by Donald Pleasance and I think Nancy Allen. It's everything that predates horror films made before 1983. So it was including The Exorcist, and I think that was the first time I saw anything from The Exorcist. And then I was interested in seeing it, and same feeling. I had nightmares. I was a kid when I saw it. I was much younger than you. I think people forget the power of these movies. I wonder, because I know there was a revival of The Exorcist just last week. I wonder if kids feel the same way about it.
Yeah, with Ellen Burstyn, 50 years later, coming back. I have no interest in seeing it. I mean, it's a real franchise, though. How many sequels were there? There was the Exorcist 2, The Heretic. There was Exorcist 3, Exorcist the Beginning, I think.
That was made twice. Yeah. Because Paul Schrader made Exorcist Dominion, and that bombed before it even made it to theaters. And so they kind of canceled Schrader's picture and reshot it with Rennie Harlan, the director of Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and a few other movies. And so, but then there was a demand to see Paul Schrader's movie. And so they released them both. A remake of the same movie, it was like a thrown-out picture that was released in theaters. So there was Exorcist the Beginning, like you just mentioned, and then there was Exorcist Dominion. And Roger Ebert gave it a really fair review, Paul Schrader's version. But none of them lived up to the original, and the only one that came close was Part 3, the one with George C. Scott as Kinderman.
Oh, yes. I'd forgotten about that. We just have a couple minutes here before the bottom of the hour, and we'll open up the phone lines and take questions and comments, and perhaps people want to suggest what they think is the greatest horror film of all time. We should point out The Exorcist. That was the first time a horror film ever won Best Picture, the Academy Award for Best Picture.
Did it win Best Picture, or
was it nominated? Or maybe it was just nominated, but it was the first time. Right.
Wow. Yeah. I know later Silence of the Lambs won Best Picture.
Yeah, but this was the first time.
Wow.
Interesting. We'll come back, and I want to talk to you about Return of the Living Dead, because there's kind of an interesting backstory to this whole franchise. And I don't know if there was any animosity between, was it Russo and Romero, and who would get credit for which film and so forth. But we'll talk about that on the other side. And also, one of my favorite werewolf movies. It's scary, but it's also funny. An American Werewolf in London, and hopefully, time permitting, we'll get around to another Tobe Hooper classic, Poltergeist. Christopher Garetano is with us, and we'll take your calls, as I say, when we come back, right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Coming to you from the home studio in Old Thornhill, just north of Toronto. The Federal Aviation Administration has spoken out on the dangers of Starlink satellite potentially injuring humans on Earth. By 2035, debris from low Earth orbit objects like Starlink satellites could fall and injure or kill someone, the FAA said in a report to Congress. The dramatic rise of non-geostationary satellites, particularly those in low Earth orbit, pose an increased risk to people on Earth and aviation due to re-entering debris, the report reads. In the paper, the FAA claims around 28,000 fragments from Starlink satellites could survive Earth's atmosphere and reach land. What's more, the casualty expectation, which is defined as the number of individuals on the ground predicted to be injured or killed by debris surviving the reentries of satellites, would be 0.6 per year. This means that one person on the planet would be expected to be injured or killed every 2 years. You can read more of this story in the news section of it, coasttocoastam.com. And if you like what you hear from me tonight or this morning, you can visit my website, strangeplanet.ca. There you can stream and subscribe to my podcast, Richard Serrett's Strange Planet. New episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you want to get deeper into Strange Planets, you could think about maybe becoming a premium subscriber. There are 3 subscriber tiers to choose from. You get access to commercial-free listening, bonus episodes, and a free subscription to my monthly newsletter, Inner Sanctum. It's all right there at strangeplanet.ca. All right, back to more of my conversation with award-winning filmmaker Christopher Garetano as we discuss the greatest horror films of all time. Back with more on Coast to Coast AM. And we're back with Christopher Garetano, award-winning filmmaker, podcaster, Off to the Witch. Check it out. It's terrific. And the new screenplay in book form, South Texas Blues, soon to be a motion picture. Let's talk Return of the Living Dead. For me, I remember when this movie came out in 1985. Back then they had something called $2 Tuesdays, and I remember seeing it for $2, and it was worth every penny because with this film, suddenly zombie movies were scary again. How do you feel about Return of the Living Dead?
I think Return of the Living Dead is a masterpiece. I love George Romero's zombie movies, and particularly Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. I met George. I went to the set of Diary of the Dead years later and hung out with him, and what a great guy, and truly an independent filmmaker for life, even though he worked with studios here and there. But Dan O'Bannon had previously worked with John Carpenter on Dark Star, and then he worked with Alejandro Jodorowsky on this development of this incredible Dune movie that never got made, okay? And then he was recruited by Ridley Scott for Alien, and he worked on that screenplay. And Return of the Living Dead was Dan O'Bannon's first directorial film, okay? He was around a lot of movies and, collaborated on so many different things, visual effects, screenwriting, but this is a brilliant man, a very intelligent man, and I think only an intelligent person could have made a movie like that. This isn't some dumb movie, and I've seen plenty of those, but it's like this movie is okay. I think Dan O'Bannon was obsessed with Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. You could see elements of that in Dark Star, okay, and then you can see elements of it in Return of the Living Dead. And what I mean by that is, in Dr. Strangelove, there's this great balance of satire and drama because it's somewhat terrifying at times because you really know what they're riffing on. And the disorganization of the military and the mess-ups and all of those things are in Return of the Living Dead in that script. And it was such a departure from the George Romero zombie picture. And it was a beautiful blend. It was this wonderful blend of comedy and horror. And very few people have been able to do that. John Landis being another, an American Werewolf in London. But Return of the Living Dead it was like a great song. It had all the right beats and the editing, and the dialogue was fantastic. And the performances were pretty dramatic at times, too, from some of the somewhat amateurish actors. They were great. I love that movie. I really do.
You know what made it scary for me? The zombies were fast.
Yeah.
They didn't just, kind of stumble along. They moved. They sprinted towards their victims. That was scary.
Either.
Yeah.
And they were intelligent. They spoke. They want, okay, so that one scene, this is great. So there's one scene where paramedics are murdered by these corpses that rose from the grave because of this chemical that went into the air after bodies were cremated ultimately at the funeral home. A lot goes on before that. But so once that starts happening, these paramedics come out of the mortuary and or the embalming room, and they go out to their ambulance, and they're attacked and killed, and one of the zombies goes in and says, "Send more paramedics," into the radio.
I remember that. Yes. Very funny.
But yeah, there are elements of Strangelove in Return of the Living Dead. If you really know what to look for, it's there. And that was just by a really brilliant guy who, and again, this is a chaotic set as well. There was a lot of arguing going on, a lot of tense moments on set, people getting fired. William Munns, who ended up writing that wonderful book, The Analysis of the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film was one of the makeup artists on Return of the Living Dead. And he must have had a bad day or bad week on there because his work wasn't really stellar on the set, and he had a lot of arguments in terms of his pay grade and everything else that was going on. And so they hired later Tony Gardner and a few other makeup artists to really do most of the makeup that you see and some of the fantastic special effects. But William Munns ended up doing the Tar Man zombie, if you remember that, the one that came out of the canister. And they were actually really happy with that, but I think he had a horrible time on that set. Tensions, fights, arguments, but look at the movie that was made in the end.
I think I read where Tobe Hooper was attached at one point to this film as well. I mean, he didn't end up directing, but he was considered. He
was the original director that was signed on for it. And if you see a couple of Hooper-esque situations involved, one of which, his friend James Karen was in the movie. I think some things still remained. Hooper was supposed to do it. And he ended up doing Life Force, which Dan O'Bannon also co-wrote that screenplay.
All right, let's go to the phones. Ted is trucking in Texas. Ted, welcome to Coast. Good evening. Are you there, Ted? Oh, we're working on getting Ted. He's driving a truck, so.
All right, no worries.
So,
there we are.
What's your take on Invasion? Yeah, what's your take on Invasion of the Body Snatchers? You didn't mention that. And also, what did become of Linda Blair? And then the last thing I want to say is when it comes to special effects makeup artists in L.A., Bea Neal, she won an Academy for Beetlejuice. But she throws the most bodacious Halloween parties. That was 25 years ago. I'm sure she's still doing it. So I'll take your response off air. Thank you.
Okay, Ted, thank you. So Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that was remade, 3 times?
Oh, yeah, several times over. I think more than 3. But the Philip Kaufman remake, I think, might be the one he's referring to. And that's the one I really grew up watching. And that was amazing, the one with Donald Sutherland and Leonard Nimoy. I love that movie. To this day, I love that movie. And that's a powerful film. That's another great remake. Again, I'd love to. There's so many horror films I'd love to talk about tonight. I just, we chose a few, and there are hundreds that I love equally. I just think these ones are powerful films that have some great backstories.
Well, we'll do it again. Linda Blair, post-Exorcist. I mean, she had...
She dated Rick James.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, what happened to her?
Well, she came back for John Boorman, who's a fantastic director, who directed Excalibur and Deliverance, came to do the sequel with Richard Burton, right? And it just didn't pan out, and she played Regan McNeil in the sequel. And then she was in Hell Night. Remember that slasher movie, Hell Night?
Yes.
Roller Boogie, right? She was in that. She was in a bunch of movies, and then she was in a Blair Witch parody many, many years later, obviously. And there's word on the street she's coming back to reprise her role in another Exorcist sequel, the sequel to the sequel to the sequel thing that came out last year. But, I mean, I don't expect it to ever match what Friedkin and Blatty did and everybody else, obviously, that participated, did with that original film. I think it's time to continue to make original horror pictures. I know, studios want to make money off these so-called franchises, but they're not great, And I think if you want to say of modern horror films, Midsummer, Ari Aster's Midsummer, wow, that's a weird original horror film. I think that was powerful.
Okay. Let's see. Pete is in North Carolina. Pete, welcome to Coast.
Hello.
Hi there. Go ahead, Pete. You're on the air.
Hey, I got to tell you, I'm digging the show. It reminds me of campfire stories when I was a kid. But 3 things here you might get a kick out of. I came across this the other day. This was the original film version of Frankenstein from 1910, made by the Edison Film Company. You got a kick out of seeing this as opposed to the Karloff version 20 years later, where he's actually making the monster in a big stewing pot.
Huh.
Oh, yeah, that Thomas Edison's Frankenstein. Yeah, wow. And then, what was it, 1896, the very first horror film, Georges Méliès, the great cinemagician, made House of the Devil. They say that's the first horror film ever. I used to think it was Edison's Frankenstein. I didn't know that it went back that far.
1896.
The other two things you might get a kick out of, if you can pull them up online, is the Saturday Night Horror Show with Vampira. And I wanted to ask you, who did the makeup for Lon Chaney's Wolfman? And appreciate it.
John Chambers. Wasn't it? No. Jack Pierce. Jack Pierce did it. I'm thinking of Planet of the Apes. John Chambers did Planet of the Apes. Jack Pierce did Lon Chaney Jr.'s makeup in Universal's The Wolfman.
I still enjoy those Universal monster movies, all of them.
I love them. Yeah, even like I said, Landis was inspired. He felt the greatest comedy horror was Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman, and that was his inspiration for horror comedy. However, in American Werewolf in London, both an American Werewolf in London and Return of the Living Dead, there are some incredible dramatic performances in there. And even in American Werewolf in London, there are moments with David Naughton that even get depressing, like it was an intelligent blend of comedy and horror. It was like the way life can be funny during tragedy. It's brilliant. It never got stupid, in my opinion.
No, I agree. Great special effects, and when it was being funny, it was funny, and then it just turned on a dime. Terrific filmmaking, American Werewolf in London. Did it get its due at the time?
I think that did. I think that was actually a success. And some of these movies weren't, and they weren't truly praised until years later. I know The Exorcist was a hit, right, when it came out. But again, what a weird movie to be a hit. I mean, I guess it was the times, maybe? There was some very strong, powerful movies being made, and Friedkin was not a horror director at the time. He was the guy that made French Connection.
Right. Let's see. John, another trucker. John is trucking in Ohio. John, welcome to Coast.
Morning, guys. Boy, I'm right up here at my alley. I grew up on this stuff. The thing I want to comment, like you were singing these movies like Psycho, Halloween, even Jaws, the music also intensifies, like Jaws, that dun dun dun. We're chasing. You have that.
Oh yeah, John Williams. Yeah.
And then you have, and by the way, I was listening to a podcast, and Eleanor Rigby. Paul was saying George Harrison, that movie Psycho, it influenced him, and you can hear the violin, or when they're doing that dun 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 dun, you can hear that note that they used from Psycho in that movie. And
in the song, you can hear it. Yeah, you can hear it in Eleanor Rigby. Yeah,
you can hear it, and he was talking about that. And then I was also going to comment barf bags. Do you remember those? I remember my sister going to see Night of the Living Dead. And they brought one home, and we had one during The Exorcist, because that's when we were old enough to see that. And I'm remembering that, but I don't know when they got rid of that. And then one last thing, the George Clooney one with Taryn Quintino where they robbed the bank. I can't think of the name of it.
From Dusk Till Dawn.
I saw that movie. Oh my God!
Yes.
And I didn't know what this was about, so I go to the movie, and halfway through, the twist. I'm like, oh my God! And it turns into a vampire movie. That was really clever.
Yeah, and Tarantino was inspired by a lot of drive-in pictures like Race with the Devil with Warren Oates and Peter Fonda. And so it's kind of like that, right? So like they're on this camping trip in their RV, and then all of a sudden they come across this cult of like Satanists in the middle of the woods sacrificing people. I think all of that was the influence for something like From Dusk Till Dawn.
All right. Great call, John. Let's go west of the Rockies. Penelope is in Los Angeles. Penelope, welcome to Coast. How are you?
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, I'm actually Penelope Cedro. I was in Nightmare on Elm Street 3.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Freddy Krueger. And I'm a long time Coast listener. I've been listening since the Arpel days, and I just called in. I thought I might have something to share.
Yes, I'm sure. Thank you.
Nice
Thank you for calling.
Yeah, and I was just listening to the previous caller talking about the humor. I think in Nightmare on Elm Street 3, that is when Freddy started making these, humorous jokes before each kill. And I think that's what brought it into, a different stratosphere of interest. And
Penelope, wasn't Frank Darabont one of the writers of?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. Wow. From Shawshank Redemption. And what an honor to be part of that. And so I just thought I'd call in. If you want to ask me any questions, ask me a question.
Well, thank you so much, Penelope.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up watching that movie. I loved Dream Warriors, and I remember your death scene in particular. And a lot of people have quoted what Freddy Krueger says before you get killed so many times.
Yes, they do. And that was actually, I don't know, that was a made-up line. It was not in the script. Robert Englund improvised that line. Welcome to prime.
What was the line? What was the line?
Welcome to prime time, bitch. He improvised.
Oh, dear. Yikes.
And, but I do, when I do conventions, which I don't do that many, but the fans they just it affected them, that movie. Like they say it helped them.
I'll bet.
Like,
Penelope, I wish we had more time. Thank you so much for calling. We're up against the clock here, but that was fantastic that you called in.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye. Christopher Garitano, South Texas Blues, soon to be a motion picture. Congratulations, Christopher. Great job tonight. Fascinating stories. Thank you so much. Always enjoy speaking with you. We'll do it again.
Likewise, Richard. Thank you so much.
All right. And everyone, check out Off to the Witch, the podcast. All right. When we come back, we'll tell some ghost stories from the Deep South. Southern Gothic podcaster Brendan Schexnayder is next on Coast to Coast AM.